Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast for Age Soul War. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and today I have a guest whom I have known for, as we just discussed, a long time, 14 years at least, we think,
Yeah, we think.
potentially a little more. And I'm going to welcome today Aaron Mars. He is a historian in the U.S. State Department or Department of State. I'm going to get that right here, Department of State. He works primarily with modern stuff regarding sub-Saharan Africa, but he also holds a PhD from the University of South Carolina. Um, as football season is around the corner, don't have any ideas right now, please. He I'm going to mention the second book he did first because he actually got a little help and I have it somewhere on my shelf, which is the book Foreign Relations of the United States, 1917 to 1972, Public Diplomacy. I think that dealt with the foreign relations Fru's books, and you kind of got a little bit of correspondence from me from Hamburg on that one.
Yes.
But he is also a 19th century transport, travel, movement historian, I guess we would call it, because he also wrote Railroads in the Old South. And the one we're going to talk about today is the newest one, The American Transportation Revolution, a Social and Cultural History, which came out in April of 2024 with Johns Hopkins University Press. So first of all, thank you so much, Aaron, for joining me here today, taking time out of the taxpayer-funded State Department work. And yeah, so tell us I guess, first of all, how did you come to continue working on the 19th century when you are constantly surrounded by modern day politics? And let's go with that first.
Yeah, th thank you so much. It's a great question, and I do want to start by thanking you for having me. I'm delighted to um, see you again, even if it's only on the screen, and talk to you about history. Um, I was trained as a 19th century historian, as you mentioned, in my doctoral work at the University of South Carolina. And I just continue to have an interest. I think it's a fascinating time period, a lot of interesting questions that sort of remain to be explored.
Mhm.
And so, as best I have been able to over the course of um, the past 18 years working at the Department of State during nights and weekends and moments of annual leave and some leave without pay to go do research. I've managed to continue to working on the 19th century um, separately from my job. So um, just trying to keep a foot in both. I mean, obviously for my daytime employment, keeping track of historiography of U.S. foreign relations there. And but I still really enjoy and find fascinating the 19th century. So I've been doing that on my own time ever since.
Yeah, I guess the 19th century holds a lot of appeal considering how many of the Cold War historians all of a sudden are like last books they write or third books they write is all of a sudden on the 19th century and kind of like, okay, hey,
Well, yeah,
welcome
yeah,
there.
yeah. Welcome. There's room for everyone. It's I think there are a lot of great lot of great resources, great questions. So it's a fascinating time period to work in.
Yeah, exactly. And this one is an interesting one because your first book is on railroads, so you're continuing with the railroad scene, but now you're also seeing throwing steamships into your conversation. So I guess I'm going to ask first, why did you feel there was a need for a book that sort of in the way you did, so that you can explain that to the audience a little bit, looked at steam transportation both on rails and on water?
Yeah, there's the historiography of American transportation is rich, but there were a couple aspects of it that I thought could use some tweaking.
Mm.
And one of probably the principal aspect is that a lot of the historiography is focused on sort of economics and politics, and rightfully so. I mean, that's economics are sort of why so many of the boosters wanted these transportation developments to move forward. It's moving goods, it's moving
Mhm.
people, it's decreasing the cost of transportation across the board. So that makes total sense. And then on the political side, there were a lot of political conversations and
Mhm.
innovations, chartering corporations, that sort of thing that had to happen in order for this to move forward. And so at the time period we're looking at in the early 19th century, that's still sort of innovative, and there's a lot
Mhm.
of really interesting work going on there. Um, Another aspect of the history of transportation after the Civil War is that there's a really nicely well-developed historiography that talks about
Mhm.
social and cultural history,
Yep.
but mostly just considers the postbellum period. So there's
Mhm.
wonderful work on women in transportation,
Mhm.
um, on travel, on African Americans and train, so on and so
Mhm.
forth, run down the list of topics, but mostly it considers these topics after the Civil War is concluded. And so what I wanted to do, um, I think sort of two things that spurred the creation of the second book. One, when I started my dissertation, which became my first book, I thought that I was going to have a much broader comparative aspect
Mm.
uh, to it. And I
Okay.
quickly realized that if I was ever going to graduate, I needed to pare back. Couldn't research the entire North and the entire South
Right.
and hope to finish. And of course, finishing is a critical aspect of
Right.
graduate school.
Yeah.
And so I pared that back and concentrated largely on the South in that
Mhm.
first book. But so when that was over, I still had a little shoebox of research that I'd started, and I wanted to expand that further. And so
Yeah.
that was um, one genesis, and then the other was just I knew from my reading of the primary research that the people living in the United States during this time periods, they themselves did
Mhm.
not classify. They didn't sort of put into different
Right.
boxes these types of transportation. Just as, when I fly home to visit my parents, I walk to the metro, then I get on the metro to the airport, then I get on the
Mhm.
plane to Iowa, and then my
Yeah.
parents are picking up in their car. That's one, two, three, four, five different types of transportation, but
Yeah.
it's all seamless
Yeah.
in one sort of movement.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to try to treat all aspects of steam transit, railroads and steamboats, as sort of one unified experience,
Mhm.
because that's how the antebellum Americans saw it themselves.
Right. Yeah, no, it's that makes total sense. It is a we don't think it's like it's point A to point B, and the it's sort of one process that we go through, and that yeah,
Right,
that's no, it's
right.
a great, brilliant way of thinking there. We yeah, sometimes you don't think of like breaking things down to that level that is so normal to us and was probably normal to them on a scale too.
Yeah, I mean the that normalization idea and process is another thing that really intrigued me, and
Yeah.
is also something where I think the cultural, uh moving away from the economics and politics for a second and looking at the cultural, I think that's part of where we see that normalization. Um the anecdote that opens the book, which is of a young lady in Texas seeing
Mhm.
the railroad for the first time, and she writes in her diary that everything seems perfectly normal
Mhm.
because of everything she had read and heard. And so to me, that was one of those moments as researcher where you're like, yes, this is this perfectly encapsulates the the argument that I'm
Hmm.
trying to make
Yeah.
because there was so much cultural production
Hmm.
happening in the early 19th
Right.
century that someone who had never seen, I mean, by 1860, railroads are everywhere, but they weren't in her
Mhm.
part of Texas. And so
And
for her to be able to experience so much through culture that when she
mhm.
finally did see one for the first time,
Yeah.
it appeared normal. Um, that's the sort of transformation and examining cultural production that I was really interested in doing.
Mm, yeah, totally. And I'm glad you already mentioned the words that I was going to go with next, even though like it's sort of hidden up there on that shelf, like down that road. Um, because you do kind of talk a little about like this period. We're looking at the antebellum. We're looking at sort of the antebellum 1850s, but also sort of the late, like whatever we want to call it,
Yeah.
1840s. And we had so many different names for it, right? We had like the age of Jackson at one point. Then we had the like um market revolution that we described it at, and then the most recent that I at least can think of, like Daniel House's Age of Transformation. And
Hmm.
you kind of seem to agree with Howe in this transformation, but you also seem to like wanting to complicate it a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I thought transportation revolution was appropriate. I mean, in part because Uh, I mean, it's the title of the book. I mean, in part because that's what I'm focused on. So I'm trying to sort of draw attention uh to that. And but I like your point about complicating because obviously for for George Rogers Taylor and other people who have written about transportation revolution um back several decades ago, it was that earlier, mostly economic story that they were trying to tell unsuccessfully. I'm like,
Mhm.
I have no truck with that scholarship. It's wonderful work. But so I was trying to do was borrow that same term, but turn our focus a little bit
Mhm.
towards other aspects of what was going on. I you're right. We do have a variety of different terms for this 1810 to 1860 time period. My guess is that scholars are going to select whichever one they think is most resonant
Mhm.
for the work that they're doing. And for me, transportation revolution was still appropriate because as I hope is clear from the contents, when people write about their experiences, uh, revolution is entirely appropriate way
Mhm.
to think about it. They were blown away by what these machines were able to change in their lives.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like the 50s when the airplane starts for a lot of people, and it's just or the wheel for the first humans, and yeah, there's certain moments where just it everything changes in that.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
Even though today in the United States railroads, it's sort of like, what's that?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of interesting. Railroads in the United States today um they play a huge role in freight.
Right.
But they are largely hidden
Yeah,
from what most Americans experience. Now, I live in the Northeast Corridor, so I'm in one area where
you do.
passenger rail travel still functions
Yeah.
pretty well. But you are correct that, for I think for most Americans, they don't think about trains day to day,
Hmm.
but a lot of the goods that they use have traveled some part of their journey by train
Yeah.
to get to the store where they bought them. So trains do play a massive role in freight right now, but they are sort of hidden
Yeah.
from the larger cultural conversation.
It is sort of an irony when you think of it, how the United States had this massive rail network for passenger travel and cargo travel, and the rivers were arteries of transport. And like today, you look at like Europe, and it's like, or in the United States, there's a couple of cruise ships that go up and down the Mississippi, and like couple, literally, and then in Europe you have like dozens. We lived in near Linz for a while, and it's like there were sometimes were 5 or 6 ships docked. It was cruise
Wow.
passengers, and
Yeah. Yeah.
from there you could take a train and be in an hour in Salzburg. It's like it's just the kind of modality of travel that you mentioned there was Iowa. It's incredible how things have changed in that, or revolutionized,
Yeah.
if you like.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the stuff is always evolving. So I
Yeah.
mean, who knows? Anything's possible.
Yeah. No, you did mention that, and I love that part, right? It's like when we think about where you're living in the Washington area and then New York, Boston, that is a corridor, an artery, and that we still have a lot of travel in. And as I read your book fairly closely, I might not have picked up everything, I'll admit that. But I did notice a lot of references to like Massachusetts and New York and sort of the Mid-Atlantic and New England states. And I noticed there was a lot of like, and you mentioned that in the introduction to that was sort of what happened as a result of the way you found materials, that it was more about
Mhm.
railroads at times than it was about steamships. And I kind of wondered, like how did you approach your sources? Where did you find some like I don't think you found a treasure trove somewhere that no one had ever looked at, but you kind of, I assume, read sources differently. And
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of this was reading diaries
hmm.
and hoping that at some point somebody got on a train or a steamboat. And if
Oh,
they
how's that
and if they
insidious?
I didn't, well, I mean, I learned a lot. And I mean, the good news is people did travel. And so as a general rule, um, it was, they were relatively high, percentage shots. And I like reading, primary sources. I mean, that's the fun, one of the fun parts of being a historian. So it wasn't that, it was okay, but it was, it's interesting. Um, to the point about sources, you are correct that there wasn't, I don't think I turned over um a lot of new things. It's in terms of I've read the same railroad annual reports that everyone else has been reading. Um, but history starts with questions, right? I
Hmm.
mean, we start out with a question and we try to um and the questions that we have
Hmm.
lead us to read sources in ways that are different than people who read them with different questions.
Hmm.
And so I think that part of what I was doing was just looking at the material with different questions. And if I can borrow an example from the first book momentarily, um, the big thing that sort of clued me into that possibility was a material on slavery.
Hmm.
Um, these annual reports of Southern railroad corporations are just chock full of
Hmm.
material about slavery. But if you're not going through asking questions about that, if you're worried about how are they things funded and how did they
Hmm.
sell bonds and all that sort of thing, um, this is not part of what you're going to be looking for. So part of this is looking at similar sources with different questions, which is something
Hmm.
historians do all the time. I
Right.
obviously, I didn't invent that. Um, but a lot of it was through, well, I read a lot of things that are not cited in the book, right? And so it's just
Yeah, I
you
can
you just
imagine.
you just got to read a lot of material and excuse me. Read a lot of material and the great news is when you do come across stuff, it's usually fantastic because people
Hmm.
are writing in their, they're writing their private thoughts in their diaries or writing to their friends. And so many of the evocative um, metaphors
Hmm.
that ordinary people used to
Right.
describe their travel experience. I mean, those are all diaries, letters, personal stuff, but it takes a lot of reading
Yeah.
um, to get there. Um,
Well,
on the geographic
mhm.
issue, I certainly tried as best I could to to get a swath of America. And I would hope that if other people with better access to resources in other areas can do that,
Mhm.
that would be, I'm always in favor of, more people studying this stuff. So
Yeah.
I hope it can happen.
Well, I mean, you had to read closely at times to kind of spot that. So I'm not sure how much people will notice it as well, sort of like it. But I kind of was going back to your story from Texas, right? Of like how like when that lady sees the train for the first time, it's like, oh yeah, that's how a train looks, right? It's not something special, it's something normal for her. And
Yeah.
I kind of was going to say, wonder about like, isn't that also sort of a danger with regard to your research? Because, right, the more normal something is for us, the less we would record and talk about it.
Yeah, and so a lot of these descriptions that I found are of the first time
Okay,
that
yeah.
someone stepped
Hmm.
on. It's the first time someone stepped on a steamboat, the first time someone stepped on a railroad. Now, the
Yeah.
nice thing, I mean, in terms of volume of research, is that that experience is something that expands geographically and over time, right?
Yeah.
So, if you live
Yeah.
in Massachusetts, your first experience on a or New York State, your first experience on a steamboat is going to be very early.
Hmm.
And but as you move west, it's later. So there's always time to uh people's first can happen
Hmm.
chronologically over that whole 50-year span. So there's still plenty it's not like everything changed in 1810
Hmm.
and then like that was it. There as the Sally McNeil, the woman on page one, demonstrates, there was still plenty of time for people to have their first experience.
Yeah.
Um, but you're right as when you in terms of reading similar diary entries and letters from people who have experience, how they write about it changes, right?
Hmm.
And it's sort of like the first time you experience it may be amazing, and then 10 years later, um, you're frustrated that it's not working as well as you wanted to, right? It's so
Right.
you go from being amazed to
Hmm.
being annoyed
Right.
and why isn't this thing working? Um
Right. Right.
and the other thing that I think the experience over time,
Hmm.
what you see people writing is they start to share with
Hmm.
other people
Hmm.
their own tips and tricks,
Hmm.
if you will, as they grow in their own experience. So
Yeah.
people are still writing about it, but what
Yeah.
they write changes
Hmm.
over
Totally.
time, and that changes over geography. And
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so you can have someone super experienced in Pennsylvania in 1850 and a neophyte in Mississippi in 1850. And so it's just sort of interesting to track that across time
Hmm.
and space.
Yeah. It's sort of like when you like, like we don't fly that much as individuals, but then you have these frequent flyers that on YouTube always post all their stuff, and you're kind of like, yeah, that's great, but I'm not never gonna have the miles to upgrade all the time. Yeah, like all
Yeah.
those little things where you're kind of like, but yeah, yeah, it's sort of something that's very contemporary still, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's yeah, I mean that probably applies to any technology, right? I
Yeah,
mean, this
yeah.
I distinctly remember the first time my parents bought a computer and we had a computer in the
Mm-hmm.
home,
Yeah,
whereas
yeah, yeah.
previously we did not. And now I carry something in my pocket that is
100 times,
incredible,
a million times
a
bigger.
million times more powerful
Yeah, yeah,
than our first Apple IIc.
yeah.
Uh, which did not even have a hard drive, right? I mean, it
No.
was um so I for any technology, this is going to be the case. People come in at different
Mm-hmm.
moments and
Yeah, totally.
different experiences, and what was once incredible starts to seem commonplace.
Yeah, no, exactly right. All right, let's turn like your book is interestingly organized and it so fits, I feel like the theme of that period because you hardly ever get a chronological work of this 1810 to 1860 period because it just doesn't work, right? It
Yeah.
just doesn't. You have to approach it thematically. Like you teach it thematically, you write about it thematically, and you kind of nicely broke it up in sort of different topic areas to kind of showcase how these different modes of transportation kind of became part of social norm.
Mhm.
And I want to start with community because community seemed like that big topic, right? Of like a new railroad wants to come in and you had to work with the communities. You had issues you had to deal with the community. The community like wanted more frequencies or the opening happens, the artisans come out. So how important was that relationship? But then also how good were the railroads or the steamships in maintaining and fostering those relationships?
Yeah, those are great questions. And with hundreds of different corporations operating across the country by the time we get to 1860, there
Mm,
probably is going to be gradations on
yeah.
answering that. Um, so I'd anywhere, but I think the relationships were extremely important, particularly with the railroad. A steamboat is obviously a great technological achievement, but people had seen boats
Hmm.
before,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they're using existing waterways.
Hmm.
But a railroad, in addition to being a new invention, something people
Hmm.
hadn't seen before, had to sort of impose itself on the landscape,
Hmm.
and almost always there's something already there
Right.
that has to be replaced.
Hmm.
And so that involves negotiation, that involves working with landowners,
Hmm.
that involves disputes over how much they think the land is worth. Um, and I
And we don't
think
have eminent domain yet, so you can't just
right,
take it.
right. And so this is it's a tricky problem. And I think that, railroad corporations worked very hard to um, educate people about the
Hmm.
benefits of what excuse me, um about what would happen when the railroad came through. Um, sometimes corporations had to make concessions, sometimes
Hmm.
landowners had to make concessions. There
Right.
are sort of constant debates about who's going to build the fence, who's going to maintain the fence, so you're going to
Right.
all that sort of thing. Um, I think for the most part, these things worked out, right? Because the railroads did eventually get built
Hmm.
all over the country.
Right.
And it is one of those things that sort of as after the first ones are constructed, then people can read about or see for themselves um, whether or not the benefits that the corporations promise are, quote unquote, true or not.
Hmm.
The community relations were, I think, very, very important. And I've forgotten the second part of your question.
Um, well, we're just gonna go on from here because
Okay,
I mean,
I'm
actually,
sorry.
let's think about that because I loved the kind of way how you were like, and it again so spoke to this period, right? Of like the town wants a railroad, and it's like you have to buy it almost, right? You have to bribe the railroad company, or the surveyor needs to be is getting bribed to suggest that I you should direct the railroads this way, and it seems like it so fits the period.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I think the example you're referring to is from Minnesota where people approached the engineer who a civil engineer who then swore that he would never, accept a bribe from anyone. Who knows? But it's I think that speaks to um I mean there's just always tension, right?
Hmm.
The civil engineers have their one vision of how things, if you just look at the topography and say, okay, this is where it has to go,
Right.
but it's never just a matter of topography. And
Yeah.
there's already people there, and they may have their own agendas or their own um, ideas of where they want to see the railroad go. And so it's never a simple matter of, well, this is um, the most logical route from a civil
Hmm.
engineering perspective, so off we go. There's always politics involved. And
Hmm.
the fascinating thing about a railroad to me, or one of the fascinating things, is that it had the ability to improve a town's standing,
Hmm.
obviously, if the
Yeah.
railroad goes through, but there's nothing preventing the railroad from continuing to go on. And so, unless there's some geographic barrier. So, you can lobby the railroad and become a terminus and become very profitable, but if it keeps going and then you're turned into a race station, so there are no guarantees
Yeah.
in this life that just because you convince the railroad that's going to end up having permanent benefits. So this is a topic that I don't think ever ends. It's
Yeah.
it's always is sort of constantly weighing
Mhm.
between what the corporation's interests are and the different communities that it has to
Yeah.
work with.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like the story of Buffalo Bill who buys like that town out in what is West Kansas or Nebraska, and he's trying to get the railroads there, and the railroads just like never comes. It's like it's just this financial disaster for him.
Yeah, yeah, it's just the competing different interests that have to be
Yeah.
weighed.
Yeah.
And I think for me, what's really interesting about this time period is that the corporations do have to do a lot of education
Hmm.
to
Yeah.
teach people what a railroad actually
Hmm.
is, down to like it's on tracks, it's got wheels, and um, we were talking, a bit about what makes this period interesting, and one of the things is that some of the things that we consider settled were not settled.
Yeah.
And one of those questions, of course, is like um, who gets to use the tracks? So the
Yeah.
the idea that
Hmm.
one company owning the tracks and owning the rolling stock and doing all the operation,
Yeah.
that was not a settled question. And there were some cases where rails were put down and then uh, anybody could bring their
Hmm.
cart on. Pretty quickly, it was obvious that wasn't going to work from like a time management perspective. But
Hmm.
it's one of those things they didn't know until they
Right.
tried.
Right.
So,
Well, and I was actually saying you were going to go a different direction there with
oh,
that because you also have these stories of people walking on the tracks and then falling asleep on them, much to the
I'm sorry,
yeah,
I'm
I
sorry, you
know.
just froze on me.
Okay, I will repeat
But
it here. But the walking on
okay.
the tracks, right? Like people walk on the tracks. It kind of reminded me of like a story that my classmates in Germany talked about. Like, oh yeah, we were on the last train. We just walked on the tracks back to our town where the train didn't go. And I kind of was like, why would you do that? But you have it, right? It's like people fall asleep on the tracks and then the train comes.
Yeah, this is a concept in the history of technology, which was just really important to me. Uh, as I was in graduate school, learning about this stuff and then trying to apply it into my later work, which is the the inventor of a technology and the users of a technology may have completely different ideas about
Hmm.
how the technology is supposed to be used.
Right.
And to your you're worried about your friends, the train tracks are the one place where you are guaranteed to get hit
Yes.
by a train. Uh, I mean, it needs to be level, it needs to be clear debris, it
Mhm.
needs to drain water, it needs to be a relatively efficient connection
Yeah.
between 2 points, even if it's not the straightest. Those are also great for walking.
Yeah.
And so and so people made their own use of this technology in a way that the corporation either did not expect or certainly did not intend.
Yeah.
And um, as your own example alludes, walking on the tracks has not left us. That's not a purely 19th century invention. Um, but once you put a technology out there, people are going to find different ways to use it that may
Yeah.
not be what the inventor expected.
Right.
Um, which means that the people who invented it had to then consider what are we going to do,
Hmm.
what do we do about this problem? And
Right.
so for me, that's a great example of how users and inventors uh, can have different uh, uh, concepts of what a technology is for,
Hmm.
and what it's supposed to be used for, be things that the inventors expect.
Right. Mhm.
And I'm sorry, I lost you again. Did you get any of
I got
that?
it. I got it.
Okay. Okay, great.
I'm not sure. Shouldn't be an unstable connection. I'm actually on the good network, but I don't know. But
It may be me. I'm
oh,
sorry.
well, it's okay. That's a pitfall of these kind of recording types. But I actually was thinking too because you had that wonderful episode from Michigan. Like it's just like two paragraphs, but it caught my eye where you were like, livestock gets killed by the railroad. And what do the farmers do? They go and take revenge by greasing the tracks. It's like, but it so speaks to, right, these conflicts over land, of usage of the land, how the railroad interrupts farming habits, right? And it's like, it's again spoke so much to just not just the start of railroads, but the continuation of railroads, right? Of like, it's still a problem in parts of the
Yeah,
country.
yeah, absolutely. And this is a case where I'm sure those farmers benefited from being able to ship and receive goods on the train,
Hmm.
but that doesn't mean they wanted the train to kill their livestock. So it's like sort of like just because we accept this and think it's a
Hmm.
good idea doesn't mean we're going to let you get away with everything.
Right.
Um, so it's another great reminder about how um, just these relationships, they were complex, they were not always
Hmm.
straightforward. And as you say, with sort of greasing the tracks, people weren't afraid to take their own actions to defend what
Yeah.
they saw as their rights.
Yeah. Like, I guess you could think of sort of those guys that glue themselves to runways and roads in Europe to kind of grow awareness. Like, how do you get people to pay attention? Well, grease the tracks.
Yeah.
Um, so let's go a different route because the other part that I found interesting because it's so common for us, right? Of like, I can go online and I can book a ticket today from Hamburg to Washington. And if I, like, let's say I book it with, no, I'm not going to promote any airlines here. They don't pay me for it. Like, whichever airline I book it with, um, they will probably be like, ooh, do you want a rental car with that? Do you need a hotel with that? Do you need an airport shuttle with that? And it is exactly like I mean you look at travel logs or travel guides for the 19th century, you look at newspapers, that's exactly what they did too, right? Of like, your train arrives in Cincinnati at this time, and the continuing train to Louisville leaves at this time, or the steamboat to St. Louis leaves at this stage, and they offer you like fares to kind of buy the continuous voyage for the whole thing. Um, did they do it? What's your thought? Do you think they did it sort of to get more passengers, or because they understood that the more convenient you make it, the better for everyone involved? Like, uh,
Yeah, 100%. I think this is a concept that I borrowed from the historian Will McIntosh about the commodification of travel, where,
Hmm.
prior to this point, people really had to work to
Right.
figure out how to get in between one place to another. There were not hotels everywhere. There were not
Mhm.
necessarily roads everywhere.
Yeah.
So it was a big deal. And one of the things that these corporations do is make travel something that you uh, so
They would want
not
to repeat that one.
something that you have to um it in the way and the book and outside of it of railroad companies owning their own steamships to
Hmm.
or owning stagecoach lines so that because the more destinations you can offer
Hmm.
to someone um the more likely they are going to be to buy a ticket. So yeah, uh, the corporations had every incentive to try to partner with or own outright different modes of
Hmm.
transportation if that would help them increase the number of destinations or the convenience
Hmm.
that they could offer. And you see this, I mean, you alluded to a couple examples. Another that I saw a lot was companies saying that we will check your baggage all the way through. You leave it on one
Hmm.
train
That's
and you
great.
don't have to worry about transfers.
Yeah.
Your bags will automatically be um, put on the next train, put on the boat, put on the coach, what have you. So yeah, the companies were definitely looking for ways to make things
Mm-hmm.
convenient for passengers.
Oh, great. Yeah. And I mean, we still love that today, right? Like I like when the airline checks my bags through all the way to the end and I don't have to reclaim them. It's,
Well, I mean, not only that, but it would seem crazy to us, right?
yeah.
If I mean, like when I fly to Iowa, I go through Chicago, and it's inconceivable that they would say to me, "Okay, now get out, go on the tarmac, take your bag, put it in the other plane, and get on the new plane." Like it's not even. I mean, it's not even something we would ever consider. So yeah, it's but that
Yeah.
transformation started
Yeah.
during this time period.
Yeah. But I do want to cycle back to like when you said like lack of sort of infrastructure in regard to
Mm,
like hotels and food
mm,
and stuff. That would kind of signal, even though the railroads eventually win, that the steamboat should have the legs up because they have usually cabins on board where you could sleep overnight and you kind of rest and you don't need to worry about where do I find something to eat or where do I need to find a hotel now to stay overnight and stuff. So,
Yeah, that you're pointing to a great advantage that steamboats had, and for longer journeys, you would see there might be a sleeping berth on a train, but the steamboat could easily be a floating hotel
mhm,
and
yeah.
a more convenient place to stay. And so you definitely see that in the primary sources. If if they're fortunate enough to live in an area where there are multiple competing options, then
Mm.
that is entirely a consideration. Um, and yeah.
Okay, then how do I feed myself on the train?
Uh, well, a couple of options. One, you can bring food with you.
Okay,
Uh, Two, when the train stops at a station, put down your window and say someone may try to sell you something through the window.
so
Um, and three, uh, there are also salesmen who would just walk down the center aisle. As you know, our
mhm,
layout for trains in the United States today is essentially what it was in the 19th century. So a
mhm,
center aisle down the middle, and then two rows of seats on
mhm,
either side of that. And so there were people who walked down the middle of trains selling uh, fruit, selling
mhm.
newspapers, selling books.
Yeah.
And But I think a lot of people also just sort of brought their own
Hmm.
uh, uh, food along as well.
Yeah.
And So it could go both ways. Bring your own or take advantage of people trying to sell you
Yeah.
things.
It's interesting where he says that I had to do a couple of train rides recently, and uh, Germany now does a deposit system. Like when you get a plastic bottle, then you buy it, and it's like 25 cents. When you bring it back, you get those 25 cents back. And there were a lot of
Mhm.
homeless people that hopped on the train in like Berlin and went through the garbage bins to look for those types of bottles people had thrown away. And it in that case, it cuts both ways. All of a sudden today, right? I can buy something on the train and somebody picks up this stuff and turns into money for themselves. Um, there was a lag in connection.
Yeah, no, I just I yeah, that's fine. I think people very quickly realized that a stopping train was going to be an opportunity for commerce. So if you didn't if people didn't bring their own food or then there's an opportunity to try to sell them something. And I think this is one area where at least I wasn't able to fully tease out from the literature, second primary literature. Is this something that the railroad companies themselves are overseeing or in terms of they're
Mm,
trying to make money from it themselves, or is it
right.
something they merely um, tolerate?
Hmm. Yeah.
And uh, so I can't give a definitive answer as to what degree possible, at stations, people trying to sell you stuff through the window, or someone walking down the middle of the train.
Yeah. No, it makes sense, right? It's like you look at Asia, you look at Russia or India, it's still being done on to a certain degree today. And
Yeah.
but I think where I was going to head to is like what you're alluding to is the importance of the station building, right? As sort of a place where some of that commerce can take place, where you can have like a person selling at newspapers or vegetables or
Mhm.
fruit or sandwiches or whatever. And um, how do I have to imagine it? Like either a steamboat landing or a railroad station during this period.
Yeah, I mean, I think the classic historian answer is it depends, and so it's gonna be one thing in rural South Carolina and another in Philadelphia, but I think as a general rule, these would definitely be sites of um, activity.
Mhm.
These. I think to your question about railroad stations, the scale may be different depending on where you were at geographically, but I think no matter where you were located, there was going to be a lot of activity. It's
Mhm.
goods being loaded and unloaded.
Yeah.
It's passengers getting on and off. It's people saying goodbye
Right.
to the people they love. It's welcoming them back
Mhm.
if they've been gone for a long time. So there's a lot of activity, there's emotion, there's stuff moving around. So it's maybe different in a rural outpost than it would be in a big city like Philadelphia,
Mm.
but even if the scale is different, the the basic function is going to be the same. And these railroad stations were also, going back to the point about the community.
Mhm.
Um, these were also gathering places
Oh, yeah, yeah.
um,
I remember.
for other types of events, and so there
Hmm.
could be political meetings, there
Yeah.
could be religious services. These are There could be musical concerts. If a smaller community didn't have a lot of other large structures that could serve for that purpose, then railroad stations or railroad cars could get pressed into service for to serve for these other functions.
Didn't you like make sure the connection works?
Uh, which is another great example of sure in ways that the Oh, I'm sorry.
You're fine. You're fine.
Um, it, okay. In ways that the corporation didn't intend.
Yeah, I seem to remember you had like a story in there of like wasn't there like an event in a railroad station with like 1,000 people or something?
Yeah, it was the Swedish Nightingale Jenny Lind
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
gave a concert in a I'm not gonna remember exactly, but a railroad station in Massachusetts. And it was I mean, if you know the 19th century, she was wildly
Yeah.
popular. And and so yeah, that's a great example of this infrastructure being pressed into use for something that was not originally intended.
Yeah. I just like I just trying to imagine a like a railroad station, and I think it was on the second level
Yeah.
with that many people in it and not collapsing or something.
Well, they pulled it off. So
Yeah,
it was
everyone made it out alive, I guess.
everyone made it out alive and they got to hear Ginny Lind. So there you go.
Oh, good God. Um, but oh yeah, that led to the other one that you had a I think it's the last chapter actually you devote to sort of practical tips that people give, especially for women travelers. And they always, I love the part where you kind of, one of the suggestions was like tie a ribbon around your back so you can easily recognize that, which is like, it's brilliant. We still do it at the baggage claim, right? Like my wife puts always a ribbon around our bags so that we can easily spot it, right? Like a really big like tie that I put around mine to kind of easily see it. And I thought it was brilliant, right? But let me ask it this way. Which of these suggestions that you saw was the one where you kind of went, that's weird?
Oh my. I don't know that I'm gonna remember them all. But it's
I just want one or two,
I
right?
think
You don't need to
yeah.
give me a list.
Oh yeah. Well, I thought it was weird. I think I'm sorry, I don't know that I'm gonna be able to pull one up. It's uh, but let me say this about the suggestions. One of the interesting things to me about this particular topic was um, we it's a good example of material where we're only getting one side of the story. And
Mm,
so we can see a
mm.
parent writing to a child saying, do this. But we don't know if the child was like, come on, Dad, forget it. Or do they take it really seriously?
Right,
Um,
right.
and so I think the suggestions, I'm sorry I can't remember a good example for you. Um, but they are something where um as a writer or someone looking back or a historian looking back at the time period, I try to remain cognizant that we have no idea if those suggestions were sort of gratefully received or seen as an annoyance. Um,
Right.
and I think this particularly comes up when it's men writing to women.
Mm,
Uh,
hmm.
because then there
The
is the assumption.
patronizing.
Exactly
Yeah.
right. So I mean, I would obviously love to know this part of it, but we just don't. I mean, were the women thinking, well, of course I know that. Like,
Mm.
what are you
You think
thinking
I'm
telling
stupid,
me?
right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so
Yeah.
I try to be a little careful.
Yeah.
I think the hints are good to know because of exactly what you pointed out. Like some of them are really good and we
Yeah.
still use them and they make perfect sense.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, this is one of those archival silence issues where we just don't know how
Mhm.
they were received.
Right. Right.
And particularly with that power dynamic between the person writing and the person receiving,
Mm.
there's a bit of a gap there that
Yeah. Of
unfortunately I don't
course.
know how we would fill it. Um,
Time travel.
yeah, right. Um, it's it's sort of weird thinking about, time travel. I never want to go back and meet famous people. I want to go back and be like, okay, when someone wrote you this letter, what did you think? Like the people I've been working with to try to get that other half of the story.
Yeah,
Um,
no, there are a few
but
people I
the
would like to slap and ordinary people I would like to slap and be like, why didn't you write down this?
but I'm grateful for what we have,
Yeah.
and I think the accumulation of these travel tips also speaks to the normalization of what was
Yeah.
happening. So
Hmm.
we go from amazement to here are my 10 strategies for going from New York
Right.
to Boston.
Yeah, yeah.
And when I do these things, I know that I want to be in the last car. I know that I want, to mark my luggage in this way. I know that I want to buy the ticket at that booth and not this booth. I mean, just all the things
Right.
that we all do when we travel. We accumulate knowledge
Yeah.
and figure out what's going to work for us.
Yeah.
And that happened back then as well.
Yeah. No, and there's ones that you missed, ones that I actually read an article about this morning that I did not know. Apparently, the very inefficient Deutsche Bahn has an opportunity for €5 you can reserve a seat. But if you don't claim your seat within 15 minutes, your reservation goes away.
Ah,
And there are a lot of
okay.
instances where you have to kick somebody who is in your seat out of your seat, actually. But you have this beautiful story in the book. I love that story of a massive argument on the train over somebody leaving their seat, somebody else taking their seat, and then arguing about who owns the seat.
Yeah, this one I do remember. And this
You
is
can't
a
forget that one.
no. That one was unforgettable. And it's a great example in my mind of watching in real time how norms are constructed.
Hmm.
Because there's no the railroad company, unlike the Deutsche Bahn, the railroad company in this case was not setting up the rules
Right.
for seat occupancy. It is something that the passengers were, in this case, literally arguing about among themselves. And if you get up and you didn't leave anything in the seat
Mhm.
to mark your place, then uh, your rights to that seat are over. And if the example that you're alluding to, um, not only is there an argument, but all the other passengers are getting into it as well. Everyone around them saying, stand your ground, don't give it up. And so it's a, and the fact that that happened, that the rest of the people in the car were becoming engaged in this
Yeah,
argument,
that was brilliant.
and that points to this norm construction where
Hmm.
one of the people in that argument can say, I've got everybody else behind me. You may think you know the rules, but you don't. We know the rules. This is what the rules are, and I have the right to this seat. And so I'm
But it's a
grateful.
challenge because it's the unwritten rules, right?
Yes.
There's no document that says this is how it works. And
And
I can
so
imagine for like a foreign traveler coming from Britain who works under a different set of rules, that's extremely challenging. Or like maybe there were regional differences south to north where that would be a big challenge too.
and that's, something I mean, you've lived in other countries, I've
Yeah.
traveled abroad, like uh any norm like that, you sort of move a little gingerly. You're sort
Yeah.
of like, uh okay, am I supposed to tip this guy or do I not tip? I mean,
Oh,
like,
don't start.
yeah, exactly. But it's the things you don't know.
Right.
And so, as a historian, I am really grateful that someone took the time to
Oh,
describe this argument and write it down,
yes.
because it gives us a wonderful window into how these unwritten rules were constructed,
Hmm.
and I think more importantly in this case, enforced.
Yeah.
And you're right. If you don't know the rules and you step into a social situation, it can be painful. Um,
Yes.
but this was a great. I'm really glad that someone took the opportunity to write about this, and they would have done so Um, I believe this one is from a newspaper article. So they would have written this knowing that their audience would be like nodding in agreement as they're reading along. It's a
Mm,
way for this it's a way for this nor we they are unwritten rules, but in a story when a story like this is published, that sort of helps disseminate them. And
right.
then someone can read that article in the newspaper and say, oh, okay, well, next time I get on board, I better make sure I leave my hat
Yeah.
if I get up, because then that's the only way that I know I'm going to have my seat. So this norm construction is happening in the moment, and then thanks
Mm,
to this newspaper article, it can sort of spread out.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but it's that on the moment in the train that I think I find the most is the most fascinating
Yeah.
sort of window into how that happened.
Yeah. No, I love that. That was such a great story in there. Um, all right. Let me look at some of my talking points here as we get towards sort of the last stretch for us here today.
Okay.
And there's so much more in there, but I briefly want to at least give a nod to race because that was you I have to cheat now. I think you devoted 2 chapters to that topic.
Yeah, so I have one chapter on black passengers and one on white women. So
Yes, yes.
yes.
Yeah. And so let's do the black passengers because I remembered like when I was in Georgia, I had a student who worked with the National Park Service, and they
Mm,
they they researched for the National Park Service actually the Croft story because they were in Macon and took the train down to Savannah and like the whole hiding in plain sight kind of thing that they did. And of course, in the context of that, Box Brown came up as well, and I was not aware that there were a lot of Box Browns.
yeah, I was not aware either. This is totally my own ignorance. And I promise you this just came from reading the newspapers.
Yeah.
I just I mean I was going through the black press and going for any mention of a train or steamboat that I could find,
Yeah.
and this stuff is in there. And I think it really obviously the cheat stories that get published are the ones where the people get caught. That's how we know about it. But I think it
Hmm.
really points to the ingenuity and
Yeah.
the ingenuity and the determination
Right.
of people who were enslaved to use whatever means they could grab onto to if they saw an opportunity to escape. And it is one thing. I've been working on this book for a very long time. I mean, as I alluded at the beginning, this is not my main work, so it's something that I have to do when I have sort of time outside of my job. But one thing that I've definitely noticed in the historiography over the past 10, 15 years is that our understanding of the Underground Railroad and sort of how it operated and the different aspects of it has really
Hmm.
um, sort of exploded.
Yeah.
At least it seems to me, sort of works by R.G.M. Blackett
Hmm.
and Churchill and so
Hmm.
on and so forth, really contributed to my own understanding of what was possible
Yeah.
in terms of people attempting to escape. Um,
But you have to
but
admit, I mean, it's bold, it's daring, it's
oh,
crazy to kind of
it was
put yourself
incredible.
in a box, mail yourself. You don't know how long it will take. Like, I don't even want to think of like food and toilet needs. I
Yeah,
mean,
or breathing. I mean, just like
overeating, yeah.
yeah. So each one of these stories is incredible, and I think that's why I
Yeah.
took the time to make sure I detailed all of them as best I
Yeah.
could. Usually we just have
Yeah.
one or two newspaper accounts, um, but I tried. I promise you, everyone that I could find is in the book because every single one of them was incredible,
Yeah.
and I think it is. Again, since I'm not an expert in, fugitive slave act or anything like that, I don't want to, step too far outside the bounds of my
Right.
knowledge. But for me, at least, coming to this as an outsider, and Henry Box Brown is the one that I knew,
Yeah.
and the rest of these were at least to me a surprise. So But it's one of those things again that once you read it, you're like you know exactly that this is going to be a critical part of the story
But
as soon in the
I
moment you're
think
doing the research.
also what's so fascinating about it is that it's not imitations, right? Because
Right.
the slave in Arkansas is not going to have read anything or heard anything about Box Brown. They came up with that on their own,
Well,
right? Like,
and some of them predated
yeah.
his efforts. So yeah, I mean, this is people as I knew from my first book, enslaved people played a crucial role in building and operating transportation networks
Mm,
in the South.
yeah.
And as they were doing that, they were also creating a potential means of escape,
Hmm.
not only for themselves, but also for their families, for their brothers and sisters, their compatriots, everyone who was around them. Now, that doesn't mean it was easy,
Hmm.
and because railroads and steamboats are very visible and they're
Hmm.
very
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
but if you could get on one, whether either by hiding yourself or
Hmm.
disguising yourself or having someone you're working with help you, it's the fastest way out of the South.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and so the the risk reward
Hmm.
ratio
Yeah.
is pretty substantial
Yeah.
because if you can make it work, it's it's fast. And then on the other side of the Ohio River, um, this is again where I'm sorry I'm blanking on his first name, but the historian's last name is Churchill, who's written about sort of the path to freedom north of the Ohio River. Uh, Groups that might have in the 1820s and 30s been responsible for hiding people and moving them at night, at least based on Churchill's scholarship, by the 40s and 50s, they were just buying train tickets. And so you could, um, it became a crucial part of moving people who had escaped slavery up to Canada, just by using the regular transportation infrastructure. So it had an enormous impact on people who escaped.
Hmm. Yeah, no, and I also loved how you had those conductors who were very like nice about it, right? Like there's an escapee and like there was this one story where you like told him to like get off and run to the woods and the train pulls off with the catchers on board and they have to go
Yeah,
back eventually and like
yeah. And again, for me, I just can't even, it's just so incredible to imagine the bravery
yeah,
that would
of
have taken
all.
to do for to do that because you have no idea,
Mhm.
you may not know how the person's going to react, right? You're
Yeah,
you're going up to them saying, can you hide me?
yeah.
Can you help me escape? And I think we were talking about depots earlier. Depots ended up becoming very sort of public places of where slavery, if you lived in the North and slavery
Hmm.
was just sort of an abstract concept,
Yeah.
you knew it was happening in the South, but it didn't sort of impinge on your day-to-day life.
Hmm.
A railroad station is a place where that may have changed forever.
Mm. Yeah.
Because if there is an enslaved person who has escaped,
Hmm.
let's say they've made it north of the Ohio River, and then the slave owner comes up after them,
Hmm.
an argument
Yeah.
about what is going to happen to this person um, may well have taken place right there in that train station,
Right.
like in the car that
Yeah.
you're sitting in.
Yeah.
And trains are interesting, they operate on schedules, and
Hmm.
time management was really important to train safety. And so that creates sort of a pressure, like this train is going to leave.
Hmm.
And so
There's a
I
deadline.
there's a deadline. And so um I think it's entirely conceivable that if you're a northern white person
Hmm.
who maybe didn't think too much about slavery, a railroad station or being on a train
Hmm.
might have been a place where that abstract political issue became suddenly very real and relevant, and
Right.
you can see
Yeah.
the people in front of you who are impacted by it. And I think that's another just sort of interesting way in which railroads, steamboats, transportation in general, becomes um, really relevant to larger social
Hmm.
and cultural issues. It's not just about getting from
Yeah.
point A to point B.
Well, and you have that too with like the abolitionists, right, on the trains, kind of
Sure.
preaching. It's
Yeah,
a
absolutely.
captive audience. I kind of felt
Yeah.
like, that's
This is another I think example of what was, well, at least to me is inconceivable. And I assume for most people traveling
Mhm.
today, to me it's impossible to imagine that if I got on a plane, someone would stand up and say, let's do a straw poll of how we think the presidential election is going to turn out this November. And then everybody on the plane votes and they like read off the tally. But those sort of political activities and
Yeah,
discussions
they
and
took place.
sort of,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's I just can't imagine that happening in current transit, but in the 19th century, that was definitely something that would happen. If I could say, I took a moment to look him up because I want to make sure he gets credit. It's Robert Churchill is the historian I was referring to earlier, and his work has been really, really important to me. So I want to make sure I get his name correct. So thank
Thank
you for
you.
that.
Yeah, no, it's like kind of trying to think of some of the train rides over the last year or so I had, and like it would be hard to imagine even today on a train in Europe, right? Like, sure, you get the drunk who's like singing and acting weird and like a half a train car is bothered by it, but it's not going to be the entire train that is impacted by that.
Yeah, or like sort of eagerly getting involved in a political conversation.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
right? Like
Um,
heated debates that wouldn't take place these days. It's
no,
like,
no.
can you
So,
imagine the presidential debating presidential candidates in the Amtrak lounge on the
yeah,
like train to the Pacific Northwest?
yeah, no, that it's just not something that's part of our current life.
No, it's
Uh,
not.
for which I'm grateful. So, no.
Yes, yes, I agree. Even though you get sometimes to sit next to weird people on the train, on the planes, trains too, but that's less so
Yeah.
in the US the case. But we kind of said we were going to do about 90 minutes for our get
Okay.
together today, so we are at actually a little over that, so I don't want to impact your further commitments today on Friday.
Oh, no, well, it's been wonderful for the opportunity to talk about some of the themes in the book. I'm really grateful for your interest and those of your audience. And so thank you so much
Yeah, we
for taking the
scratched
time to
the
speak to
surface,
me.
guys. We only scratched the surface. There are two chapters that we didn't even talk about in there. There's tons of great information in Aaron's book.
Well,
But
thank you.
yeah, I appreciate you taking the time. I know State Department can be a big time commitment.
Yeah, well, I'm so fortunately today's my day off. So
Oh,
I've got I'm happy to take the time to do it. I'm grateful to you for setting this up and
no.
thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And if anyone is interested, Aaron Maris's book is The American Transportation Revolution, a Social and Cultural History, coming out with Johns Hopkins University Press. So anywhere where you can find books, you can find Aaron's book. And if you are thinking about revising your Jacksonian America or however your university calls it class, has some great stories for class
Mm,
for lectures in it, I would argue. Um, so thank you, Aaron.
Great. Thanks so much.